The Water Babies. About the author. Charles Kingsley, 1819 to 1875, was a British teacher, reformer, and novelist. His books cover a range of topics from social issues, historical romances, to children's stories. Kingsley was interested in history and evolution, which greatly reflected in his historical works. He was also a remarkable poet and wrote many ballads. His novel, The Water Babies, a fairy tale for a land baby, remains one of his highly acclaimed children's fiction. Contents. Tom sets out with his master. At Hearth Place. The Old Woman's School in Vendale. Tom becomes a water baby. The Otter and the Salmon. On the Way to the Sea. Ellie and the Water Babies. Miss B done by as you did. Tom's new teacher. To shine you out. Mother Carey and the Other End of Nowhere. Tom finds Mr. Grimes. Chapter 1. Tom sets out with his master. Before reading, have you seen children working in shops or in people's houses? A long time ago, a little boy called Tom lived in a big town in the north of England. He was a chimney sweep. Do you know what a chimney sweep is? When people light fires in fireplaces, the smoke and soot rise up the chimneys and go into the air outside. Chimneys have to be cleaned from time to time, and in the olden days, people got chimney sweeps like Tom to climb up the dark, dirty chimneys to clean them. Tom had no parents, and his master, Mr. Grimes, kept most of the money that he earned, so the poor boy never had enough to eat. He cried often. He cried when he was hungry, and when Grimes beat him, and when he hurt himself climbing up the chimneys. But he also laughed a lot while playing with other boys on the street. He dreamed of becoming a master sweep like Mr. Grimes one day, and of riding a donkey and smoking a pipe the way Grimes did. He also dreamed that he would have many boys working for him. He would make the boys do all the work and beat them up just as Mr. Grimes beat him. One day, a smart groom rode up to the place where Tom lived and asked him to tell his master to clean the chimneys at Sir John Harthover's house the next day. Sir John's house was very far from where Tom lived, so Grimes and he set out for the next morning. Grimes rode his donkey, of course, and poor Tom walked behind, carrying the big brushes he used to clean chimneys with. They crossed the town and a sleepy village, and then made their way past a meadow. Tom longed to walk into the meadow to pick flowers and look for birds' nests, but he knew Grimes would not let him do so. Soon they came upon a poor woman limping along as if she were tired. Mr. Grimes asked her to ride behind him, but she said, "No, thank you. I'd rather walk with your little boy." So she walked beside Tom, and he thought he had never met such a pleasant woman. She asked him all about himself and looked sad when he said that he did not go to school and never prayed. She told him that she lived far away, by the sea. At last they came to a spring. It came out of a cave and ran away in a stream under the road. Mr. Grimes got off his donkey, climbed over the wall along the road, knelt down and dipped his head into the spring. Tom wished to do the same, but Mr. Grimes said, "You come along. Why do you need to wash yourself?" "I don't care for you," said Tom, and ran down to the stream. Grimes rushed at Tom with horrid words and began beating him. Tom, who was used to this, kicked at Grimes' shins with all his might. "Are you not ashamed of yourself, Thomas Grimes?" the woman cried out. Grimes looked up, startled that she knew his name, but he said, "No, and I have never been," and went on beating Tom. "Very true, because had you been ashamed of yourself, you would have gone to Vendale long ago." At this, Grimes stopped beating Tom and shouted, "What do you know about Vendale?" "I know about Vendale and about you." "You do?" shouted Grimes and climbed over the wall to face the woman. Tom thought Grimes would hit her, but the woman looked at him fiercely. "Who are you?" Grimes asked, and used many bad words that children should not hear. "Never mind who I am, but if you strike that boy again, I can tell what I know." Grimes got on his donkey without a word. "Stop!" cried the woman. "I have something more to say to the both of you. Remember that those who wish to be clean and will be clean, and those who wish to be foul will be foul." Then she turned and walked through a gate into the meadow. Grimes stood still for a moment and then rushed after her. But when he reached the meadow, she was not there. Tom too looked for her, but she seemed to have vanished suddenly. Grimes got back on his donkey silently and left Tom in peace after that. Chapter 2. At Hearth Place. Before reading, have you ever seen a mountain stream? At last, Tom and Grimes came to the outer gates of Hearth Place. A housekeeper came out when they rang the bell and walked with them up a long avenue lined with lime trees. When they came to the iron gate in front of the house, Tom stared at the garden inside and at the grand house. He had never seen anything like it before. Tom and his master went round the house and were let in through the back door. The housekeeper took them to a grand room all covered in sheets of brown paper and asked them to start their work. After a kick from his master, Tom went into the grate and up the chimney. He cleaned one chimney after another. They ran into each other, and at the end, happened to come down the wrong one. He came out into a room which was so pretty that he just stood and stared. There were white curtains on the window and white bed curtains and white furniture and white walls. Seeing the dresses lying about, Tom guessed that it was a lady's room. There were lovely pictures hanging on the walls. He saw a washstand with a basin, soap, brushes, and towels. She must be a very dirty lady if she needs so many things for cleaning, thought Tom. And then, looking towards the bed, he held his breath with surprise. On the bed lay the most beautiful girl he had ever seen. She looked almost like the dolls he had seen in the shops. Then, as he looked around, he suddenly saw an ugly black boy grinning at him with his white teeth, showing. Imagine his shock when he discovered that the black boy was his own reflection in the same mirror. Poor Tom burst into tears out of shame and anger. He turned in a hurry to go back up the chimney and hide. But he upset the fender, and the little girl woke up with all the noise. On seeing Tom, she let out such a scream that her nurse came running from the next room, taking Tom to be a thief. The nurse rushed at him and caught him by the jacket. But Tom doubled under her arm, ran across the room, and was out of the window in a minute. Luckily for Tom, the branches of a huge tree were spread out right under the window. Down this tree he climbed, and across the garden, over the railings, and towards the woods he ran. And behind him ran the gardener, the dairymaid, the groom, the keeper, and Mr. Grimes, even Sir John and the poor woman Tom and Grimes had met earlier. Chased Tom. Poor Tom ran as fast as he could on his little bare feet until he reached the woods. Inside the woods, he had a bad time pushing his way through the low branches and getting his fingers cut by sharp-edged grasses. Suddenly, he banged his head against a wall and thought it hurt. He was happy because he had found a way out of the woods. He climbed over the wall and found himself on the moors. By now, everyone had given up on looking for Tom, except for the poor woman. She followed him silently all the while, but Tom did not know this. At first, Tom enjoyed himself walking through the hilly land. He watched spiders and lizards and birds. But then the land became rough with rocks and stones and his feet hurt. Soon he grew very hungry, thirsty, and tired, but he walked on bravely. In a while he reached the top of a mountain. Looking down, he saw a deep green valley with a clear stream running through it. By the stream was a cottage, and next to it a little garden. If I make my way down there, I might get some food, thought Tom. So down he went, though his lips were baked and his feet were sore. He crawled and jumped, and by the time he reached the bottom, he could hardly walk anymore. So he lay down on the grass and fell asleep, and all the while the poor woman followed him silently. Tom might have gone on sleeping for a long, long time, but all sorts of insects started buzzing in his ears and nibbling at his hands and face. So he woke up and stumbled over a low wall and up to the door of the cottage. Chapter 3. The Old Woman's School in Vendale. Before reading, people often have nightmares, bad dreams, when they are ill. Have you ever had any? Inside the cottage sat the nicest old woman Tom had ever seen. She wore a red petticoat, a bedgown, and a white cap with a handkerchief over it. At her feet was a cat, and opposite her sat rosy little children learning their letters. All the children stared at Tom. Some cried with fright, while others laughed. "A chimney sweep, go away, I do not want sweeps here," cried the old woman. "Water," said Tom, and sank down on the doorstep. "God forgive me, he is a sick child. It does not matter whether he is a sweep or not," said the woman, and she brought a cup of milk and some bread from the next room. Tom drank up the milk at one go. "Where have you come from?" asked the woman. "From the moor there," said Tom, pointing up at the mountain. "Across the moor and down the mountain? I hope you are not lying." "Why should I?" said Tom, and told her all that had happened. "And you really did not steal anything?" "No." "Oh, poor child, come, I will show you a place where you can rest." But Tom could hardly stand, so she helped him along to an outhouse and made a bed for him with an old rug laid upon some fresh hay. She promised to come back after school was over. But Tom could not sleep. He tossed and kicked around and felt hot with fever. Then he dreamt that the little girl in Hearth place was saying, "You're so dirty. Go and wash yourself." Then he heard the poor woman of the meadow saying, "Those who wish to be clean will be clean." And he said, "I must be clean, I must be clean," though he did not know this because he was talking in his sleep. All of a sudden he found himself near the stream. He was not dreaming any more. He had walked there in his sleep, as children do sometimes when they are not well. He looked into the clear water and saw his black face looking back at him, and he pulled off all his clothes in a hurry and walked into the water. What Tom did not know was that the poor woman who had been following him had got into the water before him. Her clothes floated off her. The water weeds and water lilies floated around her, and the fairies of the stream came around her, for she was their queen. "Where have you been?" they asked her. "I have been soothing sick people and helping poor children and trying to stop people from doing wrong. I have brought you a little brother, but you must not let him see you. He must learn what is right and what is wrong on his own. You just stay close to him and see that he is not harmed." After this, she floated away. Tom, of course, did not hear all this. He just dipped himself in the clean, cool water and fell asleep. He had never slept so well in his life, and the reason why he did so was that the fairies changed his life. And what about the old school mistress? When she went to look for Tom, she did not find him. She thought Tom had lied to her and had ran away. But the next morning, when Sir John and the others came looking for Tom, she learned that he had not lied after all. You see, the day Tom had run away, Sir John and the others had given up looking for him and had gone back home after a while. And Sir John had heard the true story from his daughter, Miss Ellie, the beautiful little girl Tom had seen, and felt very sorry for Tom. So at 5 the next morning he set out on his pony to look for Tom, with the keeper and many others and a bloodhound. The dog led them to the top of the mountain that Tom had climbed down and barked loudly to say that Tom had gone down to Veldale, which was the place where the school was. When Sir John finally arrived at the school in Vendale, the old woman told him all that had happened the day before. And then they all looked for Tom and finally found his clothes near the river. They all thought that poor Tom had drowned because they did not know that the fairies had turned Tom into a water baby. And they were all very sad, and little Ellie did not play for a whole week. Chapter 4. Tom becomes a water baby. Before reading, have you ever seen the gills of a fish? When Tom woke up, he found himself swimming in the stream. He was about 4 inches long and had frilly gills around his neck to help him breathe underwater. And these were not the only changes. The fairies had washed him clean, and the real pretty and happy Tom had come out of the shell that had been his self as a chimney sweep. How? Well, the way of a butterfly breaks out of its case and flies away. Tom did not remember any of his old problems. He did not remember Grimes or the chimneys or that he used to be tired and hungry. He had nothing to worry about, and he spent his time looking at all the plants and animals in the river. He saw crickets running in and out amongst the stones and caddises, building their houses with silk and glue. He swam among the weeds, which seemed like forests to him because he was so small. And he saw flowers of beautiful shapes. But when he touched them, they drew themselves in because they were actually water creatures. Tom soon learned the language of the animals underwater, and he would have had a lot of friends if he were nice. But no one had taught him to be nice to animals. So, many naughty children, he poked and shouted at them, and they became scared of him. Soon he had no one to play with, and he was very lonely. Of course, the fairies could have taught him to be gentle and friendly, but their queen had asked him to let Tom learn from his own mistakes. One day, Tom found a caddis and wanted it to peep out of its house, but the door was shut. So he tore open the door and found that the caddis was all covered in pink skin and could not talk. All the other caddises shouted at Tom, "You horrid boy! If you had only let the poor caddis sleep, she would have come out in a fortnight with beautiful wings. Now you have broken her door, and she can't mend it because her mouth is tied up, and she will die." Tom felt very ashamed, but it only made him want to be naughtier. You see, there are some children who behave worse after they have been told that they are naughty. So Tom started bothering some small trouts. He chased them around until a big old trout, much bigger than Tom, ran straight into him and really scared him. Next, he saw an ugly creature with 6 legs, a big stomach, and a funny head. He started making faces at him and shouting in a very rude way. Suddenly, the creature stuck out a long arm with pincers at the end of it and caught hold of Tom's nose. Let me go!" cried Tom. "Then let me go," said the creature. "I want to be quiet. I want to split." "Why do you want to split?" asked Tom. "Because my brothers and sisters have all split and turned into beautiful creatures with wings. Don't speak to me. I'm sure I will split." Then he puffed and stretched himself and split all down his back and up to the top of his head. From inside his skin came out a smooth, slender, soft creature. He was pale and weak, and he walked slowly up a grass stem to the top of the water. Tom followed him, curious to know what would happen next. Then, right before Tom's eyes, as the creature sat in the warm sun, he grew strong, and lovely spots and rings of blue, yellow, and black started to show on his body. From his back grew 4 great bright wings, and his eyes grew large and shone like diamonds. "Hurrah! I am a dragonfly now!" cried the creature, and flew away into the air. "Oh, please come back!" cried Tom. "I have no one to play with." "All right, I'll come back after I've eaten something and looked around a little." The dragonfly kept his promise, and soon he and Tom became great friends. He talked about all the wonderful things he saw in the trees and meadows. Tom wished that he too could change his skin and have wings someday. Tom made other friends too. as he stopped bothering the water creatures. He made up with the caddises and the trout. The caddises told him stories about how they changed their skins and became winged flies. And the trout tried to teach him how to leap out of the water and turn head over heels, but Tom could never manage it. Tom often caught caterpillars and insects and fed them to the trout. Maybe he was not very kind to the insects, but it was all right because he was doing it to help his friends. Chapter 5. The Otter and the Salmon. Before reading, other than fish, do you know what animals live in water? One day, Tom and the dragonfly were sitting on the leaf of a water lily when they heard something cooing, grunting, whining, and squeaking. Looking up the water, Tom saw a great ball rolling over and over. Sometimes it seemed to be made of soft brown fur, and sometimes it seemed like shining glass. It broke up into pieces and then joined up again. Tom dived into the water to find out what it was. When he got closer, the ball turned out to be 5 beautiful creatures much larger than Tom. They were rolling, diving, cuddling, biting, and kissing playfully. But when the biggest one saw Tom, she said, "Quick, children, here is something to eat." Tom felt so scared of her sharp teeth that he slipped in between the roots of the water lilies. "Come out or you will be sorry," cried the mother otter, for that is what she was. But Tom only shook the roots with all his might and made horrible faces at her. In the end, the otter got disgusted. "Come away, children, he's not worth eating," she said. "And you can stay there till the salmon eat you." "What are salmon?" Tom asked. "Fish, you silly, and we catch them and eat them," she said proudly. "They are coming, children. I can smell the rain coming from up the sea. And the salmon will be here soon." "Where do they come from?" asked Tom. "From the sea, into the great river down below. We catch them and other fish too, and we have a jolly life except for those horrid men." "What are men?" Tom asked, though he seemed to remember dimly. "Two-legged things that can look a lot like you, only a lot bigger. They catch fish with hooks and lines and set pots along the rocks to catch lobsters. They killed my poor husband with a spear and carried him away upon a pole." And the otter grew very sad and sailed away down the stream. Tom kept thinking about what the otter had said, and the more he thought, the more he wished he could go down to the sea. He tried to swim down the stream, but he could not go very far because there was hardly any water left. Then one very hot evening, the sky grew dark with thick clouds and it started to rain. The thunder rolled and the lightning flashed and the rain poured down. The stream rose higher and rushed down, taking twigs, beetles, worms, and eggs with it. The trout dashed about eating all the insects, and the eels wriggled out from beneath the rocks and mud where they had been hiding. "Down to the sea!" they cried as they hurried past Tom. Then the otter came by with her brood. "Now is the time to go to the sea," she cried as she too rushed away. "Wait for me!" cried Tom. "Everyone is going to the sea, and so will I." And down he went with the rushing water, past sleeping villages and under dark bridges. When daylight came, Tom found himself in the Salmon River. After a while, it spread out so wide that he could hardly see across it. This must be the sea, he thought. He felt a little scared, so he thought he would wait for someone to tell him where to go. He crept into a crack in a rock and fell asleep. When he woke up, he saw a big silvery fish with a few crispin dots. "This must be a salmon," thought Tom. The salmon looked at Tom and then went on with a swish or two of his tail. Then came another salmon and another. They all passed by, swishing their tails, leaping out of the water and then diving again. At last there came a really big salmon who was helping his wife along. He said to her, "My dear, you're very tired. Why don't you rest behind this rock?" Then he saw Tom and asked fiercely, "What do you want?" "Oh, don't hurt me," cried Tom. I only want to look at you because you look so handsome. I'm sorry. Now I see what you are. I have met one or two creatures like you, and they were very well behaved and kind. Last night, one of them warned us of the nests in the river and showed us the way around them. So there are babies in the sea, cried Tom and clapped his hands. How lovely! I'll have playmates soon. Then the salmon went up, while Tom went down. But Tom took care to warn them of the otter. Chapter 6. On the Way to the Sea. Before reading, do you know of the ways in which people catch fish? One night, while Tom was on his way to the sea, something really strange happened. That night, he was sitting on a rock when he saw a red light move along the riverside and a beam of light being thrown across the water. He swam up to where the light was shining, and there, underneath the light, he saw 5 or 6 great salmon staring up. Then he heard a voice say, I think there's a fish. Tom could not understand the words, but seemed to remember the voice. He saw 3 big 2-legged creatures on the bank and knew they were men. For some reason, he felt scared. Then the man with the light looked into the water and said to his friend, who was holding a spear, Take that, big fellow, and hold your hand steady. Tom wanted to warn the salmon, but before he could do so, down came the spear and pierced the biggest of them. The poor salmon tried to struggle, but the men lifted him out of the water. Suddenly, 3 other men jumped on the men who had caught the salmons. There were shouts and blows, and Tom started remembering his old life. He found the men horrible and ugly, and blocked his ears because he did not wish to hear their ugly words. Then there was a great splash, as one of the men fell into the river and everything went still. Tom heard the others run down the bank looking for the man, and then he heard them go away. Tom waited for a long time. Then he peeped out and swam up to where the man was. The man was laying quite still in the water. Maybe he has fallen asleep, as I did, he thought. Then he went up closer and looked at the man's face, and in the bright moonlight he saw clearly that it was Mr. Grimes. Tom swam away as fast as he could. He thought, Oh, what if he also turns into a water baby? It'll find me and beat me again. He went up the river and spent the night under the root of a tree, but he could not keep away from Grimes. So the next afternoon, Tom went back. Grimes was gone. The fairies had carried him away. Tom moved down the river again. It was autumn, so red and yellow leaves rained down on the river, and sometimes the fog was so thick that poor Tom could not see. He had to feel his way around. He was lonely and scared. And sometimes he wished he would be back in the stream in Vendale. But no one can ever go back to the past. So he went on, past the town. Then he saw ships and saw the sailors lounging on the decks. One day, he felt the water turning around and round, and soon after that it became salty. Tom felt happy and light. He skipped out of the water and turned head over the heels in delight. He saw a red buoy dancing in the water up ahead and swam towards it. On the way, he met a great black seal and said, How do you do, sir? What a wonderful place the sea is. Good day to you, my little man. Are you looking for your brothers and sisters? I saw many of them playing on the sands. Hearing this, Tom felt happier and swam harder. When he reached the buoy, he climbed up and looked all around for the water babies. Then he climbed down and swam all around. Sometimes he thought he heard them, but when he looked around, he only saw gulls calling out to each other. For days and weeks, Tom looked for the water babies in the sea, on the sands and near the rocks, but he did not find any. He called out to them, but no one answered. He became lonely and sad. One day he found a playfellow amongst the rocks. It was a lobster. Tom had never seen one before, so he looked curiously at the lobster. He asked the lobster about the water babies, and the lobster said he had seen them, but he did not quite like them. They were always getting in people's way. tried to help them, and he, the lobster, did not need anyone's help. You see, the lobster was a vain fellow, but Tom did not mind. He needed a friend and was quite happy to chat with the lobster for hours. Chapter 7. Ellie and the Water Babies. Before reading, have you read a story or watched a film about a mermaid? At about this time, something really strange happened to Tom. He ran into Ellie again. How? Well, she had gone to the seaside with her family for a holiday, and on a fine December morning, she went walking on the beach right where Tom and the lobster were sitting on a rock. With her was a very wise man called Professor Pissmillspritz. He was showing her all the wonderful creatures one can see at the seaside. But she was not happy. She said, "I can't play with all these things or talk to them. If only there were little children in the water, as there used to be." "Children in the water? Whoever told you that?" "I know there were children in the water, and mermaids too. I saw them in a picture. It shows a beautiful lady in a car drawn by dolphins, with mermaids and babies all around her." The professor told her not to believe anything to be true unless she could hear, see, taste, or handle it. But Ellie kept asking, "Why aren't there any water babies?" The professor got very angry and said rudely, "Because there aren't." He was so cross that he shook his net wildly under the weeds, and poor Tom fell right into it. When she pulled the net out and Ellie saw Tom, she shouted, "It's a water baby!" "Rubbish," said the professor, because he did not want to admit that he had been wrong. Meanwhile, Tom was feeling very scared that the professor would catch him. So when the professor poked him with his finger, Tom bit with all his might. The professor cried out in pain and dropped Tom onto the seaweed. Tom dived straight into the water. "But it was a water baby!" cried Ellie, and jumped in after Tom. Sadly, she slipped and her head hit a rock. The professor picked Ellie up and took her to her mother, and then they all went home. Everyone looked after Ellie, but she slept most of the time. When she awoke from time to time, she called out to the water baby. After a week, the fairies came flying through the window with a pretty pair of wings, and Ellie wore those and flew away with them. And what happened to Tom? He kept thinking of Ellie, though he did not know who she was. Then one day, as he was swimming along the rocks thinking how nice it would be to have her to play with, he saw a round cage. Inside the cage sat the lobster, looking very foolish. "Why did you get into the cage?" asked Tom. "To eat a piece of fish that was in it, and now I can't get out," grumbled the lobster. Tom looked at the trap carefully and said, "Turn your tail up to me through the top, and I'll pull you out." The lobster was so stupid that he could not find the hole. Then Tom put his hands in through the hole and caught hold of him, but the lobster pulled Tom into the trap. "How could you be so silly? Now use your claws to break the spikes of the trap, and we'll both be able to get out," said Tom. "Dear me, why didn't I think of that?" said the lobster. He started breaking the spikes, but he had hardly broken half of them when the otter peeped through the top. She was angry with Tom because he had warned the salmon. She stuck her head in through the hole to catch him, but the brave lobster caught hold of her nose and held on. There was a terrible fight, and Tom was very scared, but the otter rolled and thumped to free her nose, but the lobster held on very hard. Tom managed to climb onto the otter's back and squeeze out of the hole. Then he waited for the lobster, and when he saw his tail, he caught hold of it and pulled very hard, but the lobster would not let go of the otter's nose. "Come along," said Tom. "Don't you see that she is dead?" And so she was, because with her nose held under water, she had run out of breath. But still the lobster would not let go. "Hurry, or the fisherman will catch you," said Tom, because he could feel someone haul up the trap. But the lobster would not listen. Tom saw the fisherman haul up the lobster and felt very scared for him. But when the lobster saw the fisherman, he snapped at him so badly with his claw that the fisherman let go, and the lobster jumped back into the sea. Then the most wonderful thing happened. Soon after he left the lobster, he saw a water baby on the sand. The water baby saw Tom and said, "Why, you are a new water baby. Oh, how lovely." And he ran to Tom and they hugged and kissed each other. "Where have you been all this while?" Tom asked. "I have been looking for you for so long." "But we've been here for so long. We play and sing amongst the rocks every day. How did you not see us?" Tom was puzzled. Then the water baby asked Tom to help him mend the rock garden, which had been spoiled by a storm. And they worked on it till the tide began to turn, and all the other water babies joined them, and they made their way back home because they did not want to be left dry on the sand. Tom wondered how he had not found the water babies before. He did not know that his eyes and ears had not opened until he helped save the lobster's life. Chapter 8. Mrs. Be Done By As You Did. Before reading, how do you feel when someone scolds you for being naughty? And where is the home of the water babies? In St. Brandon's Fairy Island. The island stands on pillars of rock which are covered with seaweed of different colors. And the soft white sand on which the water babies sleep is kept clean by crabs, sea anemones, and coral, which eat up all the dirt. Tom felt very happy in his new home and with his new playmates, but he could not stop being naughty. So he frightened the crabs and put stones into the mouths of the sea anemones until all the creatures were scared of him. The other children warned him that Mrs. Be Done By As You Did would soon come and she would not be happy with him. But Tom did not listen to them. Then one morning, Mrs. Be Done By As You Did actually came. She had a hooked nose and was quite ugly and very stern. She wore a black bonnet and large green spectacles. She looked at the children one by one and seemed to know how they had been behaving, even though she did not ask them anything. She began distributing sea sweets, sea cakes, sea toffees, and sea ices to something into his mouth. You can imagine how he felt when it turned out to be a pebble. "You are a very cruel lady," said Tom, "and you are a very cruel boy, because that's what you do to the poor sea anemones," said the lady. "How do you know?" asked Tom. "I know everything that people do. Now go and be a good boy, and I will not put pebbles into your mouth." "But I did not know that it was wrong," Tom protested. Well, the lobster did not know that it was wrong to get into the trap, but it was trapped anyway. "Aren't you a little hard on a poor boy?" asked Tom. "Not at all. I'm the best friend you've ever had. It's just that I was made to punish people when they do wrong. I can't help it, though it makes me very sad," said the fairy. And she looked so kind, sad, and tender that Tom thought she was not ugly at all. The fairy smiled at Tom very sweetly. She said, "You thought I'm very ugly, right? Well, I am the ugliest fairy, but when everybody starts behaving well, I'll become as lovely as my sister, Mrs. Do As You Would Be Done By. She will come on Sunday, and if you are good, she will be very kind and teach you how to do better." So Tom tried to be very good all Saturday, and when Sunday morning came, Mrs. Do As You Would Be Done By came too. She was as tall as her sister, but she had the kindest, sweetest, and the most tender and merry face that there ever was. All the children ran to her and pulled her till she sat down on a stone. Then some climbed into her lap, some clung to her neck, and others cuddled near her feet. Tom stood staring at all of them. "And who are you, little darling?" she asked. "Oh, he is the new baby!" all the children cried. "Then I will be his mother, and he shall have the best place." The lady took Tom in her arms and held him close. She spoke to him in a sweet and low voice. And Tom, who had never heard such words, looked up at her with great love and slowly fell asleep. When he woke up, the lady was telling the children a story. Tom listened and then fell asleep again. When he woke up next, the lady was still cuddling him. "Please don't go away," said Tom. "I've never had anyone to cuddle me before." "Don't go away," said all the children. "Please sing us a song." So the lady sang a lovely song. Before leaving, she asked Tom, "Will you be a good boy for my sake? And will you cuddle me again?" said poor Tom, who had never been loved in his life. "Of course I will, you little duck," said the lady. And Tom tried to be good for the lady's sake, just as children try to be good to make their parents happy. Slowly, she taught him how to be better, the way parents teach their children to be better, with each passing day. Chapter 9. Tom's New Teacher. Before reading, have you ever felt greedy about eating something you are not supposed to? What did you do then? People do not become all good in one day. And so it was with Tom. He grew very fond of the sweets that Mrs. B. Dunby gave the children, and he started following her until he found out where she kept the sweets. Then, one night, when the other children were asleep, he crept to the rocks where the sweets were kept. They lay in a big cabinet there. When he looked into the cabinet and saw all the delicious sweets, he half wished that he had never found them. But then he felt greedy and thought he would just have one. He ended up having another one and another till he gobbled them all up. And all the while Mrs. B. Dunby stood behind him, but he did not know. She did not say anything to him. She just felt very sad and her eyes filled with tears. She did not say anything even the next day, when Tom came to her with the rest of the children for his share of sweets. Tom felt very sick after eating the sweets and was very unhappy the whole week. But when the fairy came with the sweets next week, he ate them again. When Mrs. Do-as-you-would-be-done-by came the following Sunday, he wanted to be cuddled, but she said, "I would love to cuddle you, but I can't. You have prickles all over like a hedgehog." Poor Tom felt miserable and cried all week. When the ugly fairy came again on Friday, he told her what he had done. "I forgive you, my child," she said, and kissed him. "I always forgive people when they admit their mistakes." "Then you will take away these prickles?" Tom asked. "That only you can do. I'll get you a teacher who will teach you how to get rid of them." Tom was scared of teachers, but when this teacher arrived, he was surprised to see that she was a beautiful little girl with long golden curls. "There he is," said the fairy to the girl, "and you must teach him to be good, whether you like it or not." The girl did not seem to like it at all and may not have known how to begin, but Tom burst out crying and begged her to teach him. At this, she felt so sorry for him that she began teaching him at once. She taught him every day except on Sundays, when she went home and the kind fairy took her place. Before long, the prickles on Tom's skin vanished, and then his teacher cried, "Why are you the chimney sweep who came into my bedroom?" "Dear me!" cried Tom. "So you are the lovely girl I saw in Hearth Place." And they both hugged and kissed each other like long-lost friends. Then they started working at their lessons again, and this went on for 7 long years. You may think that Tom was very content all those years, but he was not entirely happy. He wanted to go to the place where Ellie went on Sundays. Finally, he asked Mrs. B. Dunby why he could not go there. You can go there only after you have been to a place you don't like and you've done something you don't like and helped somebody you don't like," answered the fairy. "Did you do that to Ellie?" asked Tom. Ellie blushed and said, "Yes, Tom. I didn't like coming here at first, and I was afraid of you because I had prickles all over. Yes, but I like you very much now. And now, Tom, you must learn to go to a place you don't like and help someone you don't like." Tom did not like the sound of what the fairy said, so he hoped that her kind sister would let him off. But she too said what her sister had said. This made him feel even worse. He even started feeling angry with Ellie because he believed she looked down on him and thought he was a coward. One day, he said to Ellie, "I'll go if you come with me." "I wish I could, but the fairy said that you must go alone." "I know what she wants me to do," Tom burst out. "She wants me to go to that Grimes, but he will turn me into a chimney sweep again." "No, he won't. Nobody can harm water babies, so as long as they're good," said Ellie. Then Tom started fighting with Ellie, as we often do when we do not like something someone says. "Even if they are right," he said, "I know why you're saying all this. You're just tired of me and you want to get rid of me." Ellie started crying, and suddenly Tom could not see her anymore. It seemed that she could not see him either, because she kept calling out, "Where are you, Tom?" And then her voice became fainter and fainter until all was silent. Tom was frightened that he had killed Ellie, and he screamed for Miss B to advise Judith. She came in a moment and explained that she had sent Ellie away. She took him on her lap and told him very nicely that he must go out into the world if he wanted to be a man, and that nothing would harm him if he remembered his lessons. At last, Tom agreed to go, but he wanted to say sorry to Ellie before that, and in the wink of an eye, Ellie stood before him. "I'm sorry, Ellie, and I'm going." Ellie smiled sweetly at him. Chapter 10. To Shiny Wall. Before reading, do you know of any animal that no longer exists? Tom turned to the fairy and said, "Where do I find Mr. Grimes?" "He's at the other end of nowhere," said the fairy. "You must go to Shiny Wall and through the white gate that never opens, and then to the peace pool where whales go when they die. And to Mother Carey's heaven. Mother Carey will tell you the way to the other end of nowhere." "But how will I find my way to Shiny Wall?" asked Tom. "You must find your own way, or you will never grow up. You can ask the animals in the sea and the birds in the air," replied the fairy. Then Tom and Ellie shook hands and said goodbye, and Ellie promised to wait for Tom, and Tom promised not to forget her, and Tom was on his way. After many days, Tom met the king of the herrings. He asked the herring if he knew the way to Shiny Wall. "If I were you, I would go to the Alalone Stone and ask the last of the Garfowl," said the herring, and told Tom where to find her. After 7 days and 7 nights, Tom reached the Alal Stone where the Garfowl stood alone. She looked grand, but rather odd. She wore a black velvet gown and white spectacles, and instead of wings, she had feathery arms with which she fanned herself. She went on talking about herself the way some people do. At last, Tom managed to ask her about Shiny Wall. "Of course I'll tell you. That's where we came from." And again the Garfowl talked on. And when Tom reminded her about Shiny Wall, the poor bird started crying tears of oil because she had forgotten the way. Luckily for Tom, a flock of petrels came by and said they would take him to Shiny Wall. But they had to go to Alphaulness first and wait for the great gathering of all seabirds. And they made Tom promise never to tell anyone because they feared that if men get to know, they would kill all the birds. At Alphaulness, Tom saw tens of thousands of birds. They bathed, combed themselves, chattered, and screamed without a care in the world. Finally, when all the birds went their own ways, Tom and the petrels headed for Shiny Wall. On the way, they saw a ship turned over on her side. Tom and the petrels were very sorry because everyone on the ship seemed to have died. Then Tom saw a baby in a cot and a black dog guarding it. Tom tried to help the baby, but a huge wave washed all of them into the sea. The fairies carried the baby away, while the dog changed his skin and became a water dog. The dog became a great friend of Tom's and followed him everywhere. After many days, the petrels handed Tom over to a flock of mollymawks, which then carried Tom mist and snow over icebergs, heaving and crashing in the stormy water. And finally, the Mollymawk set Tom and his dog down at the foot of Shiny Wall. "And where is the gate?" asked Tom. "There is no gate. You must dive under the ice if you have the courage." So Tom dived under the ice to the dark bottom of the sea. He and his dog swam for 7 whole days in the darkness, and then at last they saw clear water overhead. When they rose to the top, they found themselves in Peace Pool. All around it rose ice cliffs with caves and galleries for the ice fairies to live in. In the pool lay whales of all sizes and shapes, waiting for Mother Carey to change them into new whales. Tom swam up to a whale and asked where he might find Mother Carey. "There she sits in the middle," answered the whale, but Tom could only see an iceberg. "That's Mother Carey, as you will find out when you go up to her," explained the whale. Chapter 11. Mother Carey and the Other End of Nowhere. Before reading, do you know what the bottom of an ocean is like? Are there mountains and deep holes, or is it a flat? When Tom came close to the iceberg, he saw a white marble lady on a white marble throne. She sat quite still, with her chin upon her hand. She looked into the sea with great blue eyes. Her hair was as white as snow, and her dress was a silvery white. Millions of creatures of all sizes and shapes swam away from the foot of her throne. They were all her children, whom she made all day, without ever moving a finger. When Tom asked her about the way to the other end of nowhere, she asked him to look into her eyes, and to his surprise he remembered the way as if he had been there already. But the moment he looked away, he forgot again. Then she asked Tom to follow the dog, as he knew the way instinctively. But since the dog would always follow him, Tom would have to move backwards, she explained. Tom was scared that he would not be able to see his way, but the lady explained, "If you look behind you and watch the things you have passed, you will know better what lies ahead." Tom did not quite understand what the fairy said, but he followed her advice. Soon after leaving Peace Pool, he came to where the great sea mother kneads and bakes islands and mountains with the help of steam giants. It was boiling hot out there, but Tom managed to pass through. When he came to a place called Stop, and thank God he stopped because he was right at the edge of a vast hole up which was rushing hot steam. While Tom was wondering what to do next, the ground under him blew up. He flew a mile up through the sea and landed in between the legs of a strange boat. The boat was hovering above the steam. It had a great many wings and an equal number of legs. It was very angry with Tom, so it tried to drop him. But Tom held on to its claws and asked him the way to the other end of nowhere. Then all of a sudden, somebody turned off the steam, and the water rushed into the hole. And through the bogie did not quite believe that Tom wanted to go to the other end of nowhere. He said, "If you really mean what you say, jump down now." Down went Tom and his dog. When they reached the bottom, they were washed onto the shore of the other end of nowhere. First, they went through waste paper land, where all the stupid books lie in heaps. Then they came to the land where everyone else's business, and they all pulled Tom in different directions and told him he was going the wrong way. He would never have got away from them if it was not for his dog. He snapped at all of them so badly that they let go of Tom and started rubbing their legs. Then Tom reached the island of Tom Toddies, where everyone had only a head and no body. He heard them all wailing, "I can't learn my lessons. The examiner's coming." And when he went closer, he saw that they were all turnips and radishes, and not men, women, or children. He looked around, hoping to find someone who would tell him the meaning of what he saw. At last he found a stick, and this is what the stick told him. You see, at first they were pretty little children who might have grown up into fine men and women, but their parents always kept them working at lessons instead of allowing them to play as children should. So their brains grew big and their bodies grew small, and slowly they all turned into turnips and their legs became roots, because they always sat in the same place and didn't take any exercise. But you had better run away now, because here comes the examiner, and he will examine you and your dog as well. Tom went down to the shore and jumped into the sea in fright. After many more adventures, he came upon a huge building. Chapter 12. Tom finds Mr. Grimes. Before reading, whose job is it to catch people who beat up others, steal, and break laws? What happens to such people after they are caught? As Tom walked towards the building, 3 or 4 people came charging towards him, shouting, "Stop!" When they came closer, Tom saw that they were just truncheons, running along without legs or arms, and each had one eye at the upper end. Tom explained that Mother Carey had sent him, and one of the truncheons walked with Tom up to a great iron door. The truncheon knocked upon the door with its head and explained to the guard that Tom had come to see Grimes. Grimes was up chimney number 345, so the young man had better go to the roof, said the guard. At this, the truncheon gave Tom such a push that he was up on the roof, with his dog under his arm, in a moment. Tom and his dog walked along the roof until they came upon another truncheon. On hearing why Tom had come, the truncheon said, "Come along, but it will be of no use. He is the most hard-hearted man I've ever seen." At last they came to chimney number 345. Grimes seemed to be stuck in the chimney, with only his head and his shoulders showing from the top. He was all covered in soot and moaning about not being able to smoke. When he saw Tom, he said, "Why, it's Tom! I suppose you have come to laugh at me, you spiteful little boy." "I've only come to help you," said Tom. "Let's see, maybe I can help you out of this chimney." "No, you can't. This is a place where people have to learn to help themselves, as you will find out soon enough," said the truncheon. "Oh yes, it's always me. Did I ask to be brought to this prison? Did I ask to sweep your chimneys and be stuck in the very first one?" "No," answered a quiet voice from behind. "Nor did Tom ask to go up chimneys, but you beat him up and forced him to. It was Miss Be Done By as you did." When Tom saw her, he said, "Oh, ma'am, that's all in the past. But can't I help poor Mr. Grimes now?" "You can try," she replied. When Tom pulled at the bricks, he could not move them. He tried to wipe the soot off Grimes' face, but it would not come off. "Oh dear," said Tom. "I've come all this way to help you, but I see that I'm of no use at all." "Forget about me," said Grimes. "I see that you're a very good boy, and you'd better go away, because the hail will come soon, and you'll be in trouble." "What hail?" "Why, the hail that falls every evening. It's warm rain, but it turns into hail when it reaches my head." "That hail won't come any more," said the fairy. "I told you it was your mother's tears, which your cold heart froze into hail. But she has gone to heaven now, and will weep no more over a useless son like you." Then Grimes became very sad and quiet. After a while he said, "So my poor mother has gone! Oh, if only I stayed by her side in Vendale, she wouldn't have been so heartbroken." "Was she the teacher at the school in Vendale?" asked Tom. And then he told Grimes about how he had gone to her house and how angry she had been to a chimney sweep. "She had never liked chimney sweeps after I ran away from her and became a sweep. Oh, how horrid I was not to let her know where I was or send her any money. I never thought of her, and now it's too late." And Grimes started sobbing like a baby, and as he cried, something wonderful happened. His tears washed off all the grime from his face and all the cement from the bricks until he was free and washed and clean. "It's never too late," said the fairy in a gentle voice, and she seemed to have changed into her sister, the kind fairy. "If only you had listened to me when I warned you in the meadow," she said. And now she had changed into the woman Tom and Grimes had met on their way to Hearth Place. "Will you obey me now if I give you a chance?" "As you please, ma'am," said Grimes. "Be it so, then. You can leave this place and do some honest work sweeping out the crater of Etna." Then the fairy tied a bandage around Tom's eyes and took him out out of there through a shortcut. She tied the bandage so that Tom would not tell other people about the way back to the world. And in a moment, Tom was back on St. Brandon's Island, and there, sitting upon a rock, was Ellie, singing the sweetest song on earth. The fairy appeared as Tom and Ellie were looking at each other with wonder and happiness. She appeared like Mrs. B. Done by As You Did, and her sister, and Mother Carey, and the woman in the meadow. She changed each minute, and she looked more and more beautiful and dazzling. She told Ellie that she could take Tom home with her, and they lived happily ever after. And Tom's dog? Well, he took the place of the old dog Star because the old star had become tired.